Hello, my name is Brian Vaughn. I am the membership chair for SASH. I want to welcome you to the first of our three-part conversation with spiritual leaders on sexual health. This is a recorded conversation. Thank you for joining us today. Mary, if you could start, please.
Sure. My name's Dr. Mary Deach. I am currently the Vice President of Education for SASH. I'm very excited to be kind of a listener mostly in this conversation to see what types of educational tools we need to start building as a community. And just thank you all very much for being here.
I am Brian Vaughn. I am a certified sex addiction therapist, a licensed professional counselor, certified sex offender treatment provider. At one time, I was a Roman Catholic priest for the Archdiocese of Washington. I live now in Fredericksburg, Virginia, with my spouse. I was a priest from 82 to 96, served in several different parishes in the Archdiocese. In the early 2000s, went back to school in Virginia, and then eventually went back to school to get my master's in mental health counseling. And then eventually wound my way to becoming a CSAT. I first was introduced to SASH in 2015, where I met Mary at the conference in Philadelphia and have been associated with SASH. Earlier this year, I opted to co-chair the membership and partly education committee. So I'm really excited that all of you are here today and grateful to be a part. So Michael, if you could go ahead, please.
Good afternoon or good morning, wherever you might be. So my name is Mike Suppressi. I'm a clinical social worker, also a certified employee assistance professional, and also had my SASH training as well. And I guess my religious credential is I'm a deacon. And I'm kind of a rookie, so I don't know if I'm a faith leader per se. I've been a deacon for 2 years in the Roman Catholic Church. In terms of my clinical background, I started my career in the world of work. I did a lot of employee assistance work, and I discovered sex addiction working on 42nd Street for the Musicians Union in Manhattan, and it just kind of progressed. And when the internet took off, I was supervising a large external employee assistance program and came across to what we called internet addiction. And here was a lot of porn addiction in the workplace, and people were losing their jobs. And so I started an interest in that probably about 20 years ago. In the last 10 years, I've been working in private practice as an independent contractor. I work with Mary Deach at the Growth and Recovery Center in Lafayette Hill, Pennsylvania. And I run a couple groups and do some work with partners, individuals, and couples. And I'm very excited and very interested in this topic and this discussion. So I'm very happy to be a part of it. Thanks very much.
Welcome. Gina, go ahead, please.
Hi, everyone. I am an educator, an advocate, and a consultant, and currently a partner coach. I'm part of the team working with Michelle Mays at Partner Hope, and we're serving betrayed partners all over the world that are looking for support and healing. I'm a born and raised church girl. I was in the church for 40 years. I even married a pastor, and I was a pastor's wife for 10 years. And I'll draw on that experience as we're talking. I also, my purpose is to build bridges between people that are looking for help, the helping professionals they turn to, and the behavioral health specialists that they desperately need. So, bridge builder.
Thank you, Gina. Tom, please go ahead. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Tom Ryan. My book is by T.C. Ryan. That's my published name, so some people know me as T.C. I was a long-time Presbyterian pastor at the same time, and somebody struggling with compulsive sexual behavior disorder. And So it was a long story of trying to do recovery while staying in ministry. I had some support and accountability around me during a lot of that journey. But in my case, it's something that needed more significant treatment. I kind of cratered my life in 2008, and that created the opportunity for some intensive outpatient work, and that really deepened my own recovery. The aftermath of that has been evolving into coaching and consulting and speaking, and developed a nonprofit called Living Integrated a couple of years ago. You can find us at livingintegrated.org. And so we try and provide some tools that will help individuals, particularly individuals from church or spiritual backgrounds that are struggling, particularly early stages, or their early stage for them, awareness that they're struggling with compulsive sexual behavior disorder, how to apply healthy recovery practices with some healthy spiritual practices and integrate those two. Most recently gotten involved with a new 14-day men's intensive design for Christians called Boulder Recovery. Started by Dr. Michael Barta at the Begin Again Institute. So that's something new that I'm involved with. And I know Gina, I know Roy from some of his work. Brian and I have exchanged some messages. I have heard of SASH for a number of years. I got my pastoral sex addiction professional certification through the International Institute for Trauma Addiction Professionals. And a number of CSATs and PSAPs are participants with SASH, and something that I'm excited to have a participation with as well. So thanks for the opportunity to be here.
Thank you, Tom. Roy, please go ahead.
So happy to be here. My name is Roy Kim. I pastored for 8 years at a Korean Presbyterian church, serving both youth ministry for 4 years, and then the young adults at a separate Korean American church. Both were in Southern California. And I transitioned away from pastoral ministry to becoming a full-time marriage and family therapist back in 2009. And so I've been practicing full-time since 2014 when I got licensed. And I now have narrowed down my clinical focus to sexual addiction and betrayal trauma. I'm in kind of a unique position. Some people call me a unicorn in that there aren't too many Asian American Christian male therapists, let alone those who specialize in sexual addiction and betrayal trauma. And I think even more, I guess, unique about my situation is that I have my own history of sexual addiction and sexual addiction recovery, but also my own history of being a betrayed partner. So when I have clients come in, there's a big level of resonance that they can feel from me as I know what they are going through, no matter whether they're on one side or the other of that awful cycle. So I love being able to serve my clients, especially the Christian ones, because they feel so much shame, as we'll probably get into. And I also love serving pastors who have sexual addiction because I know full well what that was like, and I can create a safe space for them to find healing. So again, really glad to be here.
Thank you, Roy. Ray, please go ahead.
My name is Raymond Bell. I've been a pastor in Fredericksburg, Virginia for a little over 35 years. I'm a mental health coach, also a PSAP. Love assisting pastors and athletes and coaches and overcoming addiction issues when it comes to sex addiction, even chemical addiction. I think it's very important that the body of Christ, and especially pastors, have some type of assistance in this area, a safe space where they can talk with someone. I've loved working with pastors, running groups, and I'm just glad to be part of this group right now today.
Raymond, thank you. Thank you. Um, incredible. Incredible. Wow. This is just such a coming together of gifts, talents, experience, strength, and hope. And I think most of all, just a desire to continue to serve. Just in the interest of full disclosure, I'm also in recovery myself. So, and I forgot to mention this. This is the first national holiday for Juneteenth. So happy Juneteenth. So I'm going to go ahead and launch us into the questions, and we'll try to follow the protocol as best we can. Maybe you've had a chance to reflect on some of these questions. So the first one is, how comfortable do you feel, how comfortable do you believe congregants are in bringing their sexual concerns to you, leaders of your faith? For example, thoughts on their own sexuality, sex addiction issues, and sexual concerns between couples.
I can start. And I think it's pretty simple, honestly. I think a lot of it depends on if and how leaders, faith leaders, are talking about sexuality. I think that they can set the precedent that if they are open and it's coming into dialogue, if stories are being shared, if it's mentioned, if there's even specific education about it, from the top down, that really provides a safety net for congregants to talk to a faith leader about it, and it normalizes the discussion.
I totally agree with that. Trying to think what else might be a factor. I know that there are some pastors who are very close friends with people in their congregation, and so those congregants may feel more comfortable disclosing sensitive information to the pastors that they feel close to. And I would also say that the level of crisis that the congregant is in may also determine how likely they are to share something. Because if they feel like they are backed in a corner and they've got nowhere else to go, then they'll say, okay, I got to tell someone, and a therapist is too expensive, so I'll tell my pastor for maybe for some free counsel here. But I just wonder if they are kind of wondering about these questions, whether they would feel safe enough yet to share these things, to take the initiative to share these things with their faith leader. But I think, as Gina said, if been set from the top down, that the leaders are talking openly about sexuality and sexual brokenness and things like that, then I do think that it's probably more likely for the congregants to bring up their own issues with the faith leaders too.
Can I also add, I think the doctrine and dogma of churches will also determine how much individuals feel like they can share. Because if there's conservative doctrine and dogma, if there's dialogue about sexuality only in a marriage context, or only in heterosexual relationships or whatever, I mean, it's just that precedent really tells people in church what is allowed and what isn't allowed. And so, I think people of faith want to have conversations and understand what's happening in our culture and the complexities of sexuality. And so I think despite the dogma and the doctrines, that's an encouragement for churches.
Thank you, Gina.
Could I ask a follow-up question to that? I think it's important to, for clarification, is there a way for folks who do have more conservative doctrines to still have an open conversation to make talking about sex comfortable? Do you think?
Yes. I mean, I think even talking about the differing viewpoints and opinions and sexuality programs. Like, I mean, I remember when I was growing up in the church when there was abstinence and comprehensive sexuality ed. That was kind of at the time. And then I also grew up in the purity culture movement, but it was helpful despite the viewpoints to also at least understand what else was out there. You know, what did comprehensive sexuality mean? What does sex positive mean? What, you know, and with all the different sexual orientations and attractions. And I mean, we need at least information does not dictate behavior. And I think there's a fear in the church that just getting the information is somehow going to sway somebody. So I think, yes, despite viewpoints, knowledge is power.
If I may just support what you said a moment ago, Gina, in my first assignment as a associate pastor in a church in Rockville, Maryland years ago, there were many folks who were very fearful. Well, if you tell them about it, that means they'll do it. And so that was a really, really big struggle for many folks. Other thoughts from people?
I have pretty limited experience with this just because I'm so new. I guess the thought that comes to mind is really, it's not something, it's kind of based on the relationships and how well we have a relationship with somebody, particularly a family member who's, has a challenge or something along those lines in terms of that they're facing, and being that kind of safe person just to kind of hold them in terms of accompaniment in their whatever challenges they may experience or questions they may have. I think, it's funny, then there's certain things that can, I guess, come from the pulpit that may be helpful as well. That's a fine line in terms of particularly with doctrine and supporting doctrine and addressing issues, but it can also open doors. Recently I had discussed pornography, and as luck would have it, two congregants came to me afterwards and asked me to be on a committee for medical professionals with, they're in an addiction subcommittee, and this is for Catholic medical professionals. So what we're trying to do is just educate people and open the door that way. So, but I think it's the old social work paradigm is you need to be where people are at, and kind of respect where they're at too. I think that's very important, and also it's very important to be respectful of the context of your particular faith tradition. So that's the challenge. Yeah. But that's my thought.
I think that the church for so long has been, but this whole issue of sex has been so taboo that people have always felt uncomfortable talking about it. And so my grandmother used to say, some things are not taught, they're caught. And so I think it's very important that as church leaders move forward, that if somehow we can model what it means to have a safe environment to talk about sexuality, regardless of what it is, maybe parishioners will catch it in a very subtle way, in a very profound way, that perhaps a dialogue can start taking place. Because if you talk about it, you might appear to be something's wrong with you, or you might have a problem. People tend to shy away from the conversation. But it is a conversation that has to be had by the church, starting with church leaders.
So focusing on two aspects of that initial question and kind of piggybacking on what Raymond just said, where people feel safe to talk about things. My experience with a good chunk of my clients is that they usually have come in because they did get caught. And that's the dilemma. But looking at the examples there, where people feel okay about talking about their own sexuality, i.e., whether heterosexual, same sex, transsex, those various issues, and also how comfortable people feel who are coupled, whether in a monogamous committed relationship, same sex relationship, partnered in some way. How comfortable do you think people feel to come to faith leaders and talk with that faith leader about that?
This is my thought on it. I think people tend to turn to faith leaders for help because, first of all, they're trusted sources and it's free. And I think that that compels people to turn to faith leaders. And I think people do, they take that risk and a faith leader is someone for them to talk to. However, it depends on their experience when they turn to them for help as to whether they will ever do that again. And that to me is what's happening, is that there's too many poor experiences in sharing, because I think people, their default is to be open and is to ask for advice. But if they are misguided or blamed or shamed or not helped appropriately, then further damage happens.
I think what happens in many contexts, especially in mine, many clergy fall into the pedestal syndrome. And that means oftentimes your parishioners put you on the pedestal. And so they feel very uncomfortable coming to the God, coming to the pastor per se, and discussing maybe a sexual misgiving or a struggle they might be having. That's why I said earlier, there has to be a comfortability starting with the leader, that the people can see a level of transparency with him or her, that they're willing to be able to share. At the same time, I think there have to be other resources available within the church body that parishioner could go to beside a senior pastor or lead pastor where they feel comfortable.
Right. I think most people will just automatically go to some kind of a cost benefit analysis, before they talk to their pastor. If I disclose this about my spouse and myself, or my partner and myself, will we get in trouble? Will we be disciplined? Will we be shamed in some way? And if I don't know the answer to that question, am I willing to take that risk? They're going to weigh that cost benefit analysis. And if they feel like, oh, I don't know whether I'm going to weigh that risk, then they will stay silent, most likely, unless it's one of those crises that I mentioned earlier, where they're backed into a corner, they got nowhere else to go. And well, risk or not, this is the only avenue that I've got. And so I'm going to go this way and just hope for the best, but I think that is pretty common for people to just naturally think about what is the cost benefit here. But if they have had previous conversations with the faith leader and it went well, even for maybe something less weighty than what they're bringing up now, then it's likely that they will take that chance again because of that positive experience in the past.
Tom, I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts or input on this?
Yeah, I think it's a really great question. I think there's a lot of diversity in the church. I really resonate with Gina and everyone else that spiritual leaders have the opportunity to set a tone, and that makes a big difference. I think congregants are in lots of different places, and part of it is if they have a relationship that they feel secure and safe with. I think another part, depending on the nature of the congregation, not just its dogma or its external teachings, but actually the kind of nomenclature it uses, the kind of language that's used. Are there examples or are there comments made about the moral failing of a leader? And when we really lean into sexual behavior as the category that we all understand, when the code word moral fall is used, then that kind of sends a signal that if I'm struggling with sex, if I'm struggling with something, or if I'm in a marriage where we're struggling, maybe we're in that category of special offense. And so we tend to keep our heads down. If there's been a church discipline, quote unquote, case, and of course that doesn't happen across the great diversity of all of our churches, but in some of our churches, church discipline is handled in a more public way. And I'm thinking of an episode that I heard about quite a few years ago now, but it's not that long ago, of a youth pastor that got into a inappropriate relationship and was brought up on a Sunday morning in front of the church and told to confess his sins, and was reminded that the gospel offered him forgiveness, but he was now disqualified from service and from membership in the congregation. Would he please leave? And he had to walk down the main aisle and leave. And many in the church felt like that was an example of the church standing for moral purity and for values, and that was a good thing. But he lost that day, his spouse lost that day, everybody else in the congregation struggling with any level of, or in relationship with somebody struggling with any level of sexual difficulty and challenge, got the message, keep your head down. And that's something I think all of us in leadership and all of us that care about the health of the church need to be aware of. It is a tension to exhort others to the ethics of the New Testament, and at the same time apply the genuine gospel message that Jesus came for sinners. It's just my
Brian, if I may, going back what Thomas said, and great illustration, Thomas, is just that whole illustration just kind of just made me reflect about just the shaming that can take place in a situation when a leader is honest and sincere and maybe come forward and say, look, I've had this struggle, or it's brought to his or her attention that they're going through something, or something has been observed. The consequences of something of that magnitude when it comes to children. And I think that's why people hide in their despair. Thank you.
So I think the messaging is something that we also need to work on to anybody that's listening to this later, is to think about their own language that they're using when they're doing teachings. I think that's what I just kind of took away a little bit from all of this is, I challenge anybody who's listening to think about how you talk about things, because how you talk about things is going to invite people in. But also we need to do a better job of teaching folks how to have a non-judgmental stance when somebody comes to you and says, I'm struggling with, right? And whether it's desire discrepancy or a kink, to be able to just kind of sit with them. Because like Gina said, that first reaction is the entire scope. That's gonna create the scope of what happens next. Is that kind of where we're nutshelling a lot of this right now? Encouraging people to challenge both of those, how you react, but your language.
Yeah, I think that's right, Mary. I think it's really important to be for ministry leaders. And I know we're getting ahead in some of our topic, but it all kind of moves together in so many ways. Ministry leaders need to do their own work around sexuality and around their own sexuality. And the reality is that many of us struggle with different aspects of thoughts that we have, or behaviors we've engaged in, things that we've done in the past, or things that we've thought about in the past, or temptations that we're aware of. And we may have levels of fear about that. We may have levels of concern. We may have levels of hurt and anger around that. And those are all legitimate. So unless we're kind of aware where we're coming from, we're not very well equipped to hear someone else's story. And hearing someone else's story is absolutely essential in competent pastoral care, to be able to be present, to be affirming. Doesn't mean you're affirming choices that they've made. And for sure, if somebody's talking about something where they're harming somebody else, or thinking about something, or crossing certain ethical boundaries that we know are absolutely not acceptable, then there's a tension of accepting the person, but helping them pull back from that line and move into a place of doing their own work. Well, we can't do that unless we're a little bit aware of where we are and where our own triggers are, where our own temptations are, where our own fears are. The thing about sexuality is it's ubiquitous. The thing about sexuality is It was God's idea in the first place. I used to be rather upset with the divine being over my sexuality and how troubling I found it, and didn't think it was that great of an idea. But it's not up to me, is it? And so learning how to take life on life's terms, it means learning that everybody in our congregation's got some kind of a story, some kind of a narrative they're operating from. And for some of those, it's fear. For some, it's disappointment. For some, it's hope. For some, it's excitement. For some, it's anxiety. For some, it's very, very complex. It's not just one thing. And so when somebody trusts us enough to share, we need to be able to first normalize what they're sharing, knowing that there are other people in the body that share and struggle with those similar things, so that they're not an outcast. They're not alone. They belong. And tell me more. And if they're greeted with that, I think up front, then that creates that arena of security and of belonging, and I'm not going to be thrust out. And maybe it is safer to work on these things in the community. Just my thought.
Well, hearing these last several comments, it's a segue then to really question 3 first. How comfortable are you or us in talking about our own sexuality, and then connecting it with also number 2, which we've gotten into? What training and resources do any of us think faith leaders need around sex, sexuality, and problems? So I first invite us to just share a little bit about number 3, how comfortable are any of us in talking about our own sexuality? And then 2, what training and resources do people need?
Well, I'll just jump in. It's counterindicated because I actually wrote a book about my experiences and what I'd learned to that date in 2012. And InterVarsity published it. It's called Ashamed No More. My author name's T.C. Ryan, so forgive me for that plug. But in writing that book, I really struggled with how much to disclose about my sexuality. But I'm disclosing the fact that that I really struggled, that I reaped tremendous negative results and consequences as a part of my behavior. And I have to own those things. Part of my healing journey is coming to terms with how did I get there? Did it invalidate my spirituality and all those aspects? When I was writing the book, I was in a small clergy group, and I had a Roman Catholic brother in the group that said to me, well, and it's not because he's Roman Catholic, it's because he knew me well, and he's got a wicked Irish sense of humor. And he said, the more salacious details you put in the book, Tom, the more sales you'll be able to pull off. And I said, it's a great idea. It's a profound thought. You're absolutely right. And I just can't go there. So I actually left details out of the book because in our growth and disclosure in the Christian community, there's spheres. My sponsor, my spouse, those that are closest to me, my therapist, need to know everything, and then it moves out from there. Those of us that are in ministry leadership and are in the early stages of thinking about how to do our work are in a place where it's very difficult, I think, in most cases, to talk about our sexuality. Second thought, it is important that we be boundaried about that. Mm-hmm. Third, if we're in the middle of something that we really do need to address, it is very important to not process that from the pulpit. I don't think that that's the place for us to carry out our own externalized form of therapy, because it'll catch everybody in different places, and we haven't gotten to any place of resolution. Now, resolution doesn't mean perfection. Resolution doesn't mean we've solved everything. But we do need to get to some place of accomplishment, some kind of working through where we've gotten to a different place before we get too self-disclosing. And at the same time, we need to be honest about the fact that there are areas where we struggle, that we're not perfect, that we're not up on the pinnacle shouting down at our folks, but rather we're in the boat rowing alongside. That's not easy to do. That's terrifically hard. And my heart goes out to every ministry leader at whatever arena of service they're in, because that's a huge challenge.
Tom, thank you. Just curious, maybe 1 or 2 other folks on that.
I'd like to add that when I hear the word sexuality, I think more holistically, and I think that that's something. It's an opportunity for everyone is to not reduce the word sexuality to only thinking about sexual behavior. And so when we talk openly about our sexuality, it's really it's about who we are in every dimension. I mean, our sexuality touches on so much. And I mean, my longing for intimacy and connection, that's part of my sexuality. And my experience in my physical body from the day I was born until now and everything I've gone through, and reproductively too, that's part of my sexuality. And so I've had the privilege of raising 4 kids. And I mean, I'm still in process actually, but I have 2 boys, 2 girls. And so I've also experienced as a mom, just how much I convey about sexuality as I did diaper changes and bath time and taught them potty training, and just our attitude is part of our sexuality, and how we talk about it. And so um, I don't know, somehow by the time I became 16, I think I was disappointed that there wasn't more conversation and openness about sexuality. And I determined at age 16 that I was going to be a sexuality educator as part of my life goal, just because I wanted to be part of the solution. Um, and I don't know if that was because of growing up in the church. Like I said, I was a church girl. I just, I was told like sex is this amazing thing. And that's how I heard it was reduced down to just sex is for marriage. And someday I'm going to unwrap this present. But I realized by high school, I'm like, there's so much more to this. And why aren't we talking about this? And so I have been open about it. And it's been interesting to see in my lifetime, because I'm seen as someone open about it, I've had a lot of open conversations with others. They do feel safe to talk to me.
In that much more comprehensive way, as you said, Gina. That's a fabulous point. Maybe one other thought, and then we'll talk specifically about training and resources.
Yeah, I'd like to just jump in. Actually, just to kind of right in between Tom and Gina. And that's more of a clinical background that I have, and I often say, well, who is this in service to? So I think that's really important. I think the level, of course, my wife is involved in some of my sexualities. I have to be protective of her and respectful of that. But also it's and I guess the level of the relationship. So it's like anything, there's a dance of intimacy or a balance. It's an art more than, but if it's there to serve, and it's funny, I was going to hold off on this comment, but Marty Klein, I attended his workshop, and what I liked about him, because I come from a, obviously pretty conservative faith tradition, and he talked about how does your faith. He always asked his clients, how does their faith inform their sexuality, and how is it in service to their sexual relationship? But I also think there's the reverse of that's true. How is our sexual relationship in service to our faith? And how do we grow, quite frankly, grow closer to Christ? If you're a Christian, grow closer to God through our sexual experience and our sexuality. So I think that has to be a real important part of the discussion as well, the context. So, yeah.
Thank you, Mike. So what training do any of us think that, and resources that faith leaders need around sex, sexuality, and the problems we've talked about, just how, again, one comes across in what he or she might say, very, very, very important, or how offhanded comments might be made or initial reactions, but what training and resources can help with forming people to have an invitational, open attitude so folks can feel comfortable in approaching them?
I'll start. I remember when I was youth pastoring, and there would be some youth who would ask me, hey, Pastor Roy, I have a porn or masturbation problem. what do I do? And, I was deep in my own addiction at the time, and yet no one knew about it. And I didn't want anyone to know about it. So I said what I think many pastors say. Hey, I'll pray for you. And maybe I can redirect you to some resource, right, that may be helpful for you. And then inwardly just hope that he would never bring it up to me again, because it just got too close to just very heart sensitive, soul sensitive things for me that I wasn't ready to confront. So on one hand, pastors can get more resources, but I worry that if it's just about the resources that we can, give to congregants, then what will be perpetuated is what I did. It's like I now have this arsenal of resources that I can give to people, but I'm not really engaging with them at a human to human level. So I think in addition to resources, and there are really good ones out there, I think was it Brian or Mike that talked about the Peace app? One of you two talked about the Peace app. That is a great resource, obviously. But I do think that in conjunction with the resources, there needs to be some, we talked about a mindset change where the pastor who has maybe become a real professional at delivering the gospel actually has their own experience of the gospel in such a profound way that even the shame that they experience with their own broken sexuality and their behaviors is dealt with at the cross, And I think that's what happened for me to some extent, is that, I would never, as I mentioned before, talk about my own broken sexuality. And it's when I had an experience with the gospel anew for myself that I knew that God was on my side. I had a conversation with my then fiance about my broken sexuality, and praise the Lord, it turned out to be a wonderful conversation. And I felt like, if with God on my side and my fiance on my side, I don't mind who I share this with, because I'm supported. It's almost like, Moses with, one brother, another brother holding his staff, holding his arms up, his staff is raised. I felt like I could really share this with anyone without feeling the fear of condemnation. And so I think when a pastor has that experience that their shame is dealt with at the cross, they can then use resources, but not in a, oh, let me direct you that way, but here's a resource and let me share with you human to human in a way that's actually effective and safe for that congregant. So that's where my mind went as you're asking this question.
Well, first of all, Roy, thank you for just sharing more about your own story. And both Thomas and Raymond mentioned that they're both peace apps. So, but yeah, that's really good. Maybe another thought, and then we'll talk a little bit more about boundaries.
Well, just to follow up, I think, it's important to recognize what you're good at and what you're not good at. And I'm just drawing from my employee assistance background. We talk to managers and supervisors, and you talk about people who learn about other people's lives. They probably learn in many ways a lot more deeply than a pastor might. So it's really important to know the resources in your community. And it may actually be someone who is faith friendly, that maybe if you're Christian, maybe a Christian counselor who doesn't necessarily have to be from your particular denomination, or someone who can speak to that part of the person. But we need to be careful about what we work on and what we don't work on. Because I think some people can give, kind of bad advice or maybe way over their head in terms of whatever it is that they're dealing with. So I think any good pastor or faith leader should have, people in the local community that they can refer people to. And I'm thinking there's a guy in my group that a pastor, he frequently confessed his sin. He said, well, maybe you need to talk to somebody. So just knowing that that's a good resource out there. So, yeah.
Thank you, Michael.
Ryan, I really feel, and if this is answering the question correctly, from my perspective, I think when I talk with pastors, the greatest resource they can have right now is other pastors who can express their brokenness, their struggle, but also their recovery. And I think that would make pastors have the greatest resource they can have, another human being or another human being group or setting that they feel comfortable going to or is made available. I think one thing the seminary doesn't do is perhaps prepare leaders in that area to look at their own struggles, their own brokenness. But then when that is detected and when that is revealed to them, how do they find those avenues where they can find a safe place of homage for relief, for comfort, but also for healing? So in talking with pastors all the time, they need another clergy. Of course, they can have a therapist, but they would feel so much better if they could identify with another pastor who could say, hey, I've been here, I've done that, or I've addressed congregants who've had issues like this, and this is how I've handled.
Well, let's then go into the piece about how do we navigate boundaries within our spiritual settings. Tom has already talked about this. He gave a really great example about how to do that. But anybody else want to say anything about that? Levels of sexual tension and triggers, again, reflecting on our own experience.
I think one way of approaching it is that for many, and I've learned that in my own journey, is that you have to have accountability. That some form of accountability will help you, I think, maybe navigate, maybe appreciate and understands that boundaries are needed as you deal with every aspect of ministry. And of course, as we move forward into ministry, as we're more open, that goes with everyone. There's tension between man and man, sexual tension. There could be sexual tension between male and female. And so I believe that boundaries are so important. How you establish that, what happens when you're called into a parish or a pastoral ministry, what are some of the accountability factors that are already embedded within that job setting is very, very important. So I think for me, Brian, as I even talk about that, it helps me to reflect on boundaries are so important when you start looking at, accountability is more important when you start looking at boundaries.
Yeah, I have to agree with that. I think that level of accountability requires a profound knowledge of yourself, what your danger zones are, danger situations, certain mood states, environments. So allow them to be more open in speaking about their own broken sexuality. But it's a stance that I willingly choose to be that disclosing to the Asian community, just because I kind of understand the culture, and they need somewhat of a shock and awe approach for them to have for it to have somewhat of an impact for them. So that's one thing I wanted to contribute to the discussion.
Thank you, Roy. And I just want to ask you, Roy, since you've a few more minutes before you need to go, how can SASH be of particular help in this overall conversation?
because there's a lot on the line. Like when your livelihood depends on this, when you've built a family life and a vocation around being a leader, and people are looking to you and they expect things of you, it's really hard to know where to turn.
Gina, if I may echo that, because my experience so far with clergy who are married, it's just like many of the male clients I work with. The first ones who bring it to anyone's attention, such as me or anyone else, typically are the spouses. So that's a really, really, really good point. So
Well, and in male-dominated
yeah,
church cultures,
yeah,
if
amen,
you're a female coming and you're outing another male, I mean, there's just a lot going on here that makes it
amen,
like
amen.
there's certain individuals that need extra support and advocacy and help.
Yeah, excellent, excellent point. Other thoughts from folks? Well, let's bring it again again SASH. What are because in general, what are ways that SASH? We've got a number of really great ideas, but anything else? Anybody has any thoughts on this? Just in general, you might even have quite well, what is SASH or whatever. So
I think it's valuable. I think when someone thinks about SASH, they might want to find out primarily what do they offer. And SASH is primarily a group that can educate, a group that can share a knowledge base with other clergy about what direction they can go in to address certain issues in their life or the life of the church. And I think, Brian, you was on it when you were talking about it earlier, because even though we're talking about faith leaders from a clergy perspective, what about staff? I have staff right here. What about staff who might have their own particular issues when it comes to sexuality and sexual issues? I think churches need to know that there's an avenue where they can get information from about clinicians, about further in-depth programs that could help staff who might be struggling with particular issues, or how to create boundaries, how to find a trainer to come in and talk about transference, etc. So I believe, I don't know what word I could use off the top of my head, but sharing house, I don't know, but some type of informational station that can be able to share data with other sister churches about where they can go, and maybe find someone who has expertise in an area perhaps they may need assistance in.
Yeah. Well, and SASH has a search directory to find a specialist, and any of us like myself that are part of that, we have the opportunity to tag our specializations. So maybe we add a special tag as faith leader, or what our faith is, or something identifiable.
Or even go a little deeper. Maybe Mary and Brian, maybe and if SASH didn't have it, maybe have some type of spirituality or faith leaders division. I don't know, but somewhere where because there are some faith leaders who are pastoral counselors. There are some faith leaders who are sexual addiction coaches, who would love to have a place they can go and or even have another avenue to come for training and development. Like I thought the conference online last year was outstanding. Even though it wasn't in person, I thought it was outstanding, and that was my first introduction to it. And so, yes.
I have a couple of thoughts. One is like kind of a little bit more global, and it in terms of, it goes back to being that resource, or that, and where are the pain points of a particular church is kind of, that's kind of always the entree. If you're a consultant, you always talk, well, what are your pain points, and how do your services mesh with the particular pain points of your client? We talk a lot about being sex positive, but I don't know much about SASH. But are they faith positive? And will faith communities feel that they are, kind of respected or acknowledged. And so, I'm part of a congregation. Why would I want someone, to come to me? I mean, it kind of goes in that direction as well. And I have to be honest, I mean, we live in a kind of a post-Christian era. I know I'm talking to, we often talk in my faith community about the nuns, not the religious nuns, but the people who have no affiliation. And sometimes it's kind of, and what they do understand about faith communities is kind of stereotypical, so I think that would be, I mean, that may be a tough ask, or, but how are you faith friendly, I guess would be my thing.
So I'm also kind of hearing a call, Mike, tell me if I'm capturing this correctly, to train clinicians, inform clinicians, advise clinicians on how to be faith positive, affirming, even if it's a different background, even, we don't all need to be, a Christian counselor, but how do we accept and how do we fold your faith into your spiritual and your sexuality process, and how you translate that? Am I hearing a little bit of a call for almost not a training, but information, or maybe a training? I don't know.
Maybe. Yeah, not exactly sure, Mary. I mean, it's a good point. I mean, it's just, a lot of us are strength-based therapists. So it's kind of, how is faith a strength? So that's part of it. And how do you, and regardless of the faith, I mean, just, it goes back to being where your client's at, or your congregant is at, and just kind of moving it from there.
And I think also being careful as a clinician not to say something that tramples is the wrong, possibly too strong of a word, but tramples on somebody's faith. Being too sex positive, I don't know that you can be too sex positive, but it could interfere sometimes. Is that a little of where we're going?
I was muted. Sorry about that. Actually, I think it could be very overwhelming to certain clients.
That's a better word than trample. Thank you.
And so I think it's something to be careful about. And faith is such an important component in someone's life. It's deeply rooted. I used to, it's funny, I used to work with musicians in New York. That was one of my jobs. And one of the things from a work perspective was, all their life, they were like a violinist. And so they come to New York and they couldn't be a violinist. So their whole identity was trampled upon. And the same applies with faith. Faith is so important to people. It informs them. It gives them hope. It gives them guidance. And when people feel that that's being, I don't know, like it's being confronted in a way that's not kind, or being questioned, or even being ridiculed, quite frankly, that can be a huge problem. So there's a balance here, but I think it's just important.
I think Michael is on it. I think that the faith community just wants a level, I don't know the word, Michael, is sensitivity. They want to know that outside of organizations, as they begin to open up and share and reveal and try to build trust, that these organizations are sensitive and have a level of understanding. If you're going to go into an organization and they have no clue about the faith, the faith journey of a organized religion, or some specific structure, how things are formulated or decisions are made, then they might feel that they're foreign to that experience. But if they feel there's a level of the word I would want to use, a level of understanding that one is trying to reach a hand out and say, look, I want to get to know you better. How can I best serve you? How can I be a servant leader to the church? Wow, that's an aha for me. How could I be a servant? The church is supposed to be servant, but how can I be a servant leader to the church? Because I recognize that you're human beings too, and that you're not God and you need help. And sometimes it's hard reaching out, and I want to be there for you. that bridges a gap then where we can come together.
So again, regarding SASH, one I think concrete possibility we've talked about is how, as Gina discussed, how SASH could go to some of these Christian conferences and have a booth, et cetera, et cetera. That's a really key thing. The flip side of it, my experience, and this is something that I've reached out to Tom about in the local area where I live. I'm now an Episcopalian, and I've reached out a number of times to local church and the diocese, and not necessarily received much of a response from people. So that's why on a ministerial, personal, spiritual level, I really welcome this. It's a way of me reconnecting with something that was and continues to be very much a part of my identity. But a takeaway for me from this is, again, well, what are some continued new ways that I can try to reach out to people? And again, trying to be very respectful to people. So just to connect it with question number 11, because Gina got into this a little bit a while ago, and then I'd like to go to question 10 as we can start to wrap up. But how do we support the silence breakers? How do we help navigate some of the messages that could be perceived as against this?
Yeah, I think that question could be taken a variety of ways as to what that conjures up in our mind when we hear silence breaker. But I know for myself, I've come to really own the fact that I'm a truth teller and a justice fighter, and I can't not call something out. And there are plenty of people I've encountered that would rather I stay silent. And it's disorienting, at times, because it makes me question my own truth. Sometimes when I'm being told, like, no, that's not true, or, what's wrong with you, or this or that. But I think it's important that we break silence and that we expose. I mean, part of our faith is bringing light into darkness. And that to me is about breaking silence and leading with the truth. And so I think, just owning that and finding like-minded people is part of my particular journey of being, someone that's willing to speak up. But I think, like, one thing I wanted to mention, and this is where, something that stuck with me that I had heard years ago in my journey, was that someone said to me, and they said this in front of me and my husband at the time, you can't pray yourself out of something you behaved yourself into. That to me is an example of a truth that, like, so many times faith people, let's say, are just pounding a certain answer of, like, pray it away. Or I've been in church services where it's like, bring it to the pulpit, bring it to the cross, lay it down before you walk out the door today and you can be free. I mean, but the truth is, some of these struggles we're talking about, and this is where, like, it gets controversial, right? If I'm coming up against a PhD pastor who says, no, the Bible isn't, your faith is wrong. And I'm like, no, my truth is that you can't pray this away. You have to do something. That to me is just a practical example of how that broke down for me.
Wow. Thank you, Gina.
I mean, to piggyback what Gina was saying, I think with that illustration, I think the church has to be very creative. I think sometimes we can sit in our silence. I think sometimes that can be healthy and sometimes it's not healthy. But I think when we are truth tellers, like you said, Gina, and it's our responsibility to be practical with the gospel and real with the gospel. Where does it draw the line where I can look at the gospel, but also or the word of God, look at it but also realize the fact that there are some practical steps I have to take beside praying to come to a resolution in my life for healing. And I think the way going back to the original question, I think the church has to be creative, and even maybe SASH has to be creative in how we carry the gospel message of healing and the gospel message of recovery. Recovery is a process. Yes, there is instant healing. I believe that there is a divine force that can do that. But in many instances, recovery takes a process, which is a great testimony, a great story for many people, that I had to go through this and this and this to get to there. And so how are we creative that we don't run individuals away by, if I can use Mary's comment, by trampling over their faith, that they would feel like that. They would feel trampled versus being sensitive and saying, hey, I understand that God's going to make a way. I understand you've been praying hard. You want things to happen overnight. But let me offer you another alternative I see in the gospel. And maybe look at some alternatives that might be biblically revealing that things took time in the recovery process and not always happening in the church house, but other places also. I know I was rambling, but I hope I was able to bring some clarity there.
Thank you, Raymond. One of the people I invited to this also, and I'm sure many of us know her, is Dr. Sherry Keffer. She was unable to make it, but she's interested, and I think she would have much to say about this also. So hopefully she can come in September. I guess to draw kind of maybe a secular analogy, what we're also talking about here are whistleblowers, and what are the protections that people have. Obviously, my former tradition was shrouded in, ensconced in silence for years, and there were many children victimized as a result. And the Roman Catholic Church is continuing to go through a period of change and reform as a result, and we see it in some other traditions now too that are undergoing that. So I do think it's very, very important that we do support people who are willing to step forward and say, this is what's going on, and I need help with that. So any further thoughts before I just bring up about how we support sex offenders?
Yeah, I think when Gina and Raymond were talking, one of the things that occurred to me was there's so much of a tendency towards spiritual bypass, where we do use words, sincere teachings of faith, but we use them inadvertently to avoid the kind of psychological work we really need to be doing. And part of the seed we need to be casting. So I'm coming back around to my answer to 11. How do we support the silence breakers? We keep casting seed. Jesus talks about the parable of the sower. And it's not up to us to determine what kind of soil it lands on, but to just keep sowing. And to sow out of love, not out of accusation. To sow out of love, not out of pointing fingers, and to sow out of love and surrender expectations. That's hard because I want to see something happen. I want to see somebody respond. But I think that what we have is the opportunity to be truth tellers. And as we keep sowing out of love, there are those that initially may close themselves off out of fear, but eventually the seed will break through. It'll break through, and it'll have an effect. And we need to get to that effect to reach a tipping point in the church. That's my thought on that.
Thomas, just with that point there about sowing love, Thomas, how do you feel about in the church? And Gina, we have a lot of AA meetings in the church. We have a lot of NA meetings in the church, and people know it. They become very comfortable to some extent with AA, NA. But if you talk about an SA meeting in the church, or you talk about any type of sexual addiction, even if I need that type of group, I won't go. It's something about this behavioral addiction versus a substance addiction that just does something to the human psyche, especially in the spiritual body.
Raymond, that's exactly right. A few years ago, when I left the church that I had founded and pastored for 19 years, I went to another church, a friend's church, and I don't know of a more grace-based church, young artists. I mean, with it, Midtown, Kansas City, great congregation. And after a few years, I started an S group with Jesus as the identified higher power.
Mm.
And we met in the church building. And there was an NA group as well. And these were AA conversant folks in the church. I mean, pro recovery, yeah. But the guys that were coming to my group after a while, we moved it out of the building because they, as grace-based as the congregation was, they didn't want anybody to know they were going to an S group.
Yeah.
So we're going to have to go around sideways. We're going to have to sneak in back doors. We're going to have to make avenues open to people that are off-site, that are in until we get to a tipping point. We're going to have to help clergy. And that's one of the big things that we've got to do with those that are in faith leadership, is to create first an expectation that there are going to be struggles there. And then secondly, create pathways for genuine support and healing. And third, whenever possible, retain pathways of retaining them in leadership, whatever the level is. There are times when that shouldn't happen for their own sake or for a congregation's sake, for sure. It's a case-by-case basis. But yeah, having an S group in a church is an interesting thing. My
That
group
is-
ended up moving to another church where nobody in that congregation comes to the group. And we made it available to everybody in that congregation, but nobody's going to come in that. So yeah.
That was so profound what you just said, retain them. Gina, how you feel about that? Because usually if a faith leader has a fall, we dismiss them. What do you think? Retain them. That was so profound, Thomas. Thank you.
Yes, I think, well, you know what I reached for? This is by my table. This is a special edition of Time magazine that just came out. And it's talking about the science of addiction, but the photos are of all different kinds of addiction. And as you flip through, there's like even a hamburger, you know, they're talking about food addiction. They're talking about sex in here. They're talking. And so I guess that's where, like, we as faith communities have to treat it the same way. And I love seeing mainstream helping us out. You know, they're helping us out by being like, putting it in the context of this can show up as substances, it can show up as behaviors, it can be food, sex, exercise, shopping, gambling. I mean, the list goes on. And we know it from the 12-step world, right? You know, of all the different variety of meanings. So we've got to stop treating this, you know, the sexual issues separately. And that's where I don't think a pastor's job should be on the line because it was a sexual issue versus like the gamut of other things that he wouldn't be discharged for. But again, there needs to be a proactive, thoughtful plan in place. Like you can't just wing this stuff. You need, and when someone's hired, you need to have the respect of telling them up front how we approach it, and you know, put this magazine right there in the office.
Well, this is really a very interesting topic in so many ways. I think the thing that I like most about working with sex addiction, these are people who are definitely on the margins of all the addictions, right? And if we were talking about this in the 1940s and you were an alcoholic, you were an outcast, okay? If we were talking about this in the 1960s and you were a drug addict, you were an outcast. It's going to take some time for this to change. We have actually a game plan to make it work. I draw from my employee assistance background. I used to be on the board of directors there. There are really concrete ways to do it. You know, returning, we used to say, you know, you want to fire the problem, not the individual. That's the goal. Now there are certain things that are, you know, certainly a challenge. Brian, you mentioned kind of the history in the church with all the pedophilia and things like that. So there's got to be accountability. There has to be protection. Tom mentioned about retaining pastors, and I think that that's important. And I guess we're kind of drifting into the next topic, but there really has to be accountability. And you know, it's easy to. I used to work in transportation and with railroads engineers, and they went back to service, but we drug tested them. We made sure they were in treatment programs. And there has to, there are ways to help people. And I think that's certainly out there. But it's going to take some time. Gene, I appreciate what they're saying in Time Magazine, but this is a hard one. But we'll get there. I think it's progressing. I honestly do.
Well, that's, Micah, your reference to people on the margins. So in these last 10 minutes or so, that maybe we could spend 5, needs much more time with that, but people probably the most marginalized are, the sex offenders. Again, just in referencing the question, do you find a culture or belief that sex offenders are redeemable? And that question came out of my conversation I had with a local pastor here in Fredericksburg. She's now in charge of the street church for Micah Ministries. Micah Ministries is for homeless folks here in the greater Fredericksburg area. So just wondering any reflections on that. And her name is Chelsea Morse. She wants to participate in our next gathering in September. I'll jump in first. I'm also a certified sex offender treatment provider, and my faith, my experience of faith is that there's nothing greater than the love of God. So I do believe that persons who have harmed others by their sexual behavior, in other words, abused, offended them, they are redeemable. But there obviously needs to be safeguards and accountability and treatment for them, so that they can go on to continue to have productive lives. I've seen a number of the men and a few of the women I've worked with over the years really go on to have very integrated and whole lives as a result. But just wondering anyone else has thought about that.
Yeah, I'll jump in on that. I think that, and by the way, Michael, thank you for that. You want to fire the problem, not the person.
Yes.
Adage. That is just rich.
Yeah.
And that's the gospel. I mean,
yeah.
that's the gospel. So do there need to be boundaries and accountability? Absolutely. I mean, our go-to has to be the love and the valuing and the protection and the nurture of every soul. So if somebody's a perpetrator that's crossed lines into juvenile or pedophilic behavior, yes, there need to be boundaries that keep children safe, keep adolescents safe, keep the perpetrator safe. And I don't even like the word perpetrator. But we do need to back up and look at how Jesus sees all of us. All of us are broken and scarred and vulnerable and hurt others. And all of us are children of the light that belong to our Creator and are wanted, and and there's a place for all of us in our faith communities. Or then it brings into question, why does the faith community really exist? So we have to make place for those that have offended, and pathways for those that have offended, and be aware that that will trigger hurt and fear in others. And people need to be genuinely educated all the way around on these issues. And the more we know, then the more comfortable we become, and the sooner we will get to the right kind of tipping point. It comes back to talking about what's really going on and not hiding behind labels or hiding behind slogans, I think.
Thank you, Thomas. Well, we're at 1:54 here on the East Coast. So I thought we could just use this time for final thoughts, particularly suggestions for our next gathering, which is going to be on Tuesday, September 21st. And this one, we thought we'd do it from 1 to 3. So that would be Eastern time. Final thoughts and or suggestions.
Well, I'll just jump in real quick. Thank you. I didn't know what to expect, and I'm really happy for the opportunity. I find these discussions very meaningful, and I really cherish, value the opportunity to talk with people from different faith perspectives as well. And I wish SASH a lot of success with this.
Thank you, Michael. Great to meet you.
I believe Brian and Mary and the team, I think we're climbing the mountain. And I think we're making some traction. We're not there yet. So I believe the second half in September, if we can build on some more questions based on what was brought up today, I think we're on the right track. And thank you for inviting me. I'm glad to be part of it. Yes.
Glad you were part too, Raymond. Go ahead, Gina. I'm sorry.
It fills my heart and soul with encouragement and hope. I mean, this has been a personal longing of mine, and I have repurposed my pain by working professionally in the areas that I see the need. And, to get to collaborate like this and to be able, I see a path forward to step back into what now feels like my former life, because I did go through a divorce and my pastor husband became an atheist. There's a lot to my story. But like to be able to serve faith leaders and support those that want to embrace healing and light and recovery and all this good stuff. I just feel really hopeful and encouraged.
On a personal level, spiritual level, Gina, I echo that. It's stepping back into, and it's very meaningful for me too. About any specific, how you would envision September? What would say, oh wow, I want to make sure I come back for this, what we could focus on. And obviously we'll continue the dialogue by email with each other.
I mean, I love that there's going to be an effort, is what I hear, to personally invite faith leaders from nationally, I assume, and like that'll be live in September. That sounds amazing.
Yeah.
And then they can submit questions and there'll be a moderator, I assume. Okay.
When you have settings like this, Brian, I just get excited about coming in person. And I love the Zooms, and I love it, but I'm hoping one day that perhaps you can get a group of people together, 50, 60, 70, 80, I don't know, and really have a great dialogue about this and maybe some trainings. I really believe that that will help us get up the mountain a little further.
Possibly, yeah. Well, I want to say two things. First of all, I went to the Set Free Global Summit in North Carolina a few years back, and Josh McDowell, who's a major faith leader, was the person that spearheaded that. And there were 800 faith leaders that flew in from all over the country.
Wow.
Yeah, there were, I wish I could remember the quote. There was a quote that that prompted me to go, because it was basically saying, it was addressing pornography and problematic sexual issues among faith communities, but it was saying it's the single greatest thing that can affect someone's faith or loss of faith. So since that had been the story with my experience, my ex-husband, I was very drawn to go. But all that to say, I've personally seen how 800 faith leaders came together to talk about these issues. And I don't think there's been any follow-up. Like, I've contacted the McDowell Ministries before to be like, okay, what now? And it just seemed, but that's something maybe to piggyback off of or to do a little investigation of.
Yeah.
Second of all, I think what I've learned coming through COVID and doing all these Zoom is that for some people, this is going to be the only way that they'll join.
Sure.
Because it just eliminates all the travel and expense.
Yeah. Good point, Gina. Good point.
To Gina's point, that was a good topic, and it was someone that there was a lot of agreement there. So maybe start where there is a lot of agreement. That would be my recommendation.
Yeah. Once again, I want to thank you for taking time to join us in our conversation with spiritual leaders today. Our next event will be on Tuesday, September 21st from 1 to 3 p.m. In that meeting, we'll be further discussing issues of sexual health. If you would like more information on this event or other things happening at SASH, please sign up for our email announcements by going to SASH's website. That's SASH, all in caps, .net. Thank you for being a part of this journey with us today.